You know, they're watching me right now, and they're mad at me.
Who's they?
This is the truth that every human being needs to know in order to be able to take care of their family and teach them properly. Man, don't turn my phone off. Don't do that.
So you think they with your phone?
Oh, I'm sure of it.
My computer just froze again is what I'm trying to say. Something freaked out my computer. What I can see on that screen is not what I can see on my computer screen.
I assume they listen to everything I say.
They do.
Every time I'm shrinking in this video, it's just like, it doesn't like to do this.
Has this ever happened to y'all before?
No.
You know what's going on.
Terrence Howard is suggesting a different way of looking at the periodic table of elements. He believes the current periodic table doesn't show the true relationships between elements. For example, hydrogen is often shown alone, but he thinks it shares similar properties or tones with elements like carbon. By tone, he means a specific frequency or vibration. For instance, he compares the vibrations of elements to musical notes or frequencies. Hydrogen vibrate at 40.5 Hz, carbon at 81 Hz, silicon at 162 Hz, and so on. These vibrations or tones can be related to both sound and color as they follow similar patterns of wavelength. He references Walter Russell's periodic table, which he feels shows these relationships better than the traditional one by Mendeleev.
Walter Russell's periodic table that he put together. Now you compare that to what Mendeleev's periodic table. You'll compare Walter Russell's to it, and you'll see something completely different. It's unwinding.
Whoa.
It's unwinding. You'll see there's a relationship between hydrogen, carbon, silicon, cobalt, rhodium. They're all bonded. They're all sit as the middle point between two noble gases.
According to Howard, elements like hydrogen, carbon, silicon, and cobalt have specific relationships and act as central points between noble gases. Howard suggests that all matter is fundamentally connected, implying that what we perceive as different elements might actually be variations of one underlying substance. He notes that hydrogen is the first element we can see because anything denser isn't visible to us. When moving to carbon, he mentions it has a balance of positive and negative properties, making it unique.
As you reach into the next octave, the carbon octave, and they call that a bisexual tone because the carbon has two tones to it. It has a negative side and a positive side. The part where lithium behaves, lithium is contractive. Beryllium is contractive. Boron is contractive, but the moment you get to carbon, you balance it out. It gets to a perfect balance of plus and minus 4, so it's a double tone.
He also explains how certain elements naturally bond or react with each other. For example, fluorine will always bond with lithium, breaking any existing bonds to do so. Similarly, introducing beryllium to water will cause oxygen to bond with beryllium, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. By using frequencies, you can separate hydrogen and oxygen from water without the usual methods like electrolysis or heat. For example, hydrogen, being smaller, would go into one tube and oxygen into another, simply by using the right frequency. He provides an example with sodium and chlorine. When you rub salt, sodium, on your skin after swimming in a chlorinated pool, it neutralizes the chlorine, turning it into an oil. This demonstrates how everything has an equal and opposite mate. Howard also explains that elements can transform as they move up in frequency or octaves. For instance, lithium becomes sodium in the next octave, and sodium becomes potassium in the following octave. These transformations follow a pattern where each element doubles in frequency and becomes wider.
The reason that arsenic kills us is because our DNA has nitrogen and it has phosphorus in it, because nitrogen unwinds into the next octave right after silicon and becomes phosphorus. Our DNA has both of those in there, but it's going by tone. So the moment arsenic, which sits as a -3 on the next octave, the moment arsenic is introduced, the body thinks that, oh, this is my thing that I need. And it tries to wrap itself around the arsenic, but it causes the DNA to unravel because it's 4 times as large as that nitrogen was.
Howard talks about various elements like titanium, vanadium, chromium, magnesium, and iron, which he refers to as isotopes rather than true elements. He compares these elements to wrapping a rag around your hand. The more you wrap, the more distinct each layer becomes. With the right understanding of wave frequencies, we can now unravel these elements in ways that weren't possible before.
The angles of incidence that were necessary to open these things up. And you couldn't do that with the Platonic solids because the Platonic solids were averages and approximations.
The old models, like the Platonic solids, were too simplistic because they didn't account for the natural curvature of motion. He emphasizes that all motion in the universe is expressed in waves which are curved, not straight. Howard also talks about the balance of forces in the universe. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and this balance leads to the curvature in motion. He critiques Einstein's theory of relativity for not including this balancing force. He explains that gravity is caused by electric forces, which always seek high pressure and move in a spiral pattern. These forces eventually convert back into the electric field and return to their source.
What happens when we get older? We expand at our equator, right? We get shorter at the top. Why? Because the electric force is pushing in and condensing, and the magnetism expands out at the equator.
Electricity for the Earth works in cycles, pushing itself back out at the equator, making the equator 5 miles wider than the poles. Einstein's equations didn't separate electricity and magnetism properly. He saw them as coupled forces, but in reality, they are opposites. Electricity is like breathing in, a contracting force, while magnetism is like breathing out, an expanding, radiative force. The term magnet suggests attraction, but to magnify means to make something larger, which is the work of radiation. This idea aligns with what Walter Russell talked about years ago. Russell emphasized that radiation works to increase space, while electricity pulls things together. Traditional science teaches that opposites attract, like hot and cold air or water, but in reality they move in opposite directions. 2 magnets, for instance, seem to attract because of the way they align, similar to how 2 streams of water would push against each other but eventually align. Howard suggests we've been misled by our senses, particularly our vision, which sees only a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. This limited view has caused science to misinterpret many things. For example, E equals mc squared only talks about expansion, not contraction. We never breathe in twice without breathing out. This natural balance of in and out, charge and discharge, is missing from scientific models that focus solely on expansion, as influenced by Newton's idea that everything moves in a straight line unless acted upon. Newton's ideas have led to a 2-dimensional understanding of space which fails to account for nature's inherent curvature. This misinterpretation extends to the periodic table, where elements are seen as isolated and static rather than interconnected and dynamic. Conventional science sees carbon as always being carbon, but Howard suggests that it actually unwinds and transforms into nitrogen and nitrogen into oxygen. Walter Russell's version of the periodic table addresses these interconnections and transformations, showing elements as part of a continuous process. However, those who study the conventional periodic table often overlook or dismiss Russell's ideas, not fully understanding the dynamic nature he proposed.
Remember the Michelson-Morley experiment from 1887? They were trying to prove whether there was an ether or an effect of an ether, or the quintessence that everything came from. That used to be called the 5th element. From antiquity, everyone understood that something doesn't come out of nothing. It's like when you look at the air, it looks clear, but you change the pressure condition. The balance of the change of pressure condition, we call that condensation. It creates clouds. And you change the motion conditions, whether it's moving quickly or slowly, it's going to become snow, it's going to become rain, it's going to become hell.
Howard argues that everything boils down to 2 forces, Either you're filling up something, breathing in, or pouring it out, breathing out. He criticizes scientists for ignoring Walter Russell's work because Russell didn't use mathematical equations. Instead, Russell approached these ideas philosophically, discussing how things behave rather than strictly adhering to Newtonian physics or calculus. He criticizes scientific methods like the Feynman diagrams, which he sees as overly complex and contrived, suggesting that they eliminate possibilities until only one answer remains, a method he believes is flawed. He points out issues with probability and concepts like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and Schrödinger's cat, arguing that they stem from removing the concept of ether. According to Howard, electromagnetic waves need a medium, and effects cannot exist without a cause, like the chicken and egg scenario. Howard mentions Dr. David Tong from Cambridge, who stated that much of what is taught in physics is incorrect because it overlooks the true nature of how things work. This includes the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment, which assumed a stationary ether. However, Joseph Larmor proposed a moving ether with opposing vortices, aligning more closely with Walter Russell's views that the Sun gave birth to the Earth rather than the Earth forming from a coalesced field. Howard also highlights that the Earth is drifting away from the Sun by about 0.6 inches a year, a phenomenon observed universally as planets in solar systems drift away from their primaries at a consistent rate. This suggests a universal expansion. Recent observations like those from the Webb telescope challenge the traditional timeline of galaxy formation, supporting the idea that our current understanding of the universe's age and formation might be flawed. By calculating the drift of the Earth away from the Sun, he points out that it would take about 105,600 years for the Earth to move just 1 mile. This slow, steady drift challenges the conventional view of a static universe, reinforcing the idea of continuous movement and expansion. To understand how long it would take the Earth to reach its current distance from the Sun, 93 million miles, at a drift rate of 0.6 inches per year, it would require approximately 9.8 trillion years. Similarly for Mars, which is 147 million miles away from the Sun, it would take about 15.8 trillion years to reach its current position.
So at a given point, Mars was here in the Goldilocks zone. And now Venus is going to inherit the Goldilocks zone next. They forget that Mercury is under the highest pressure possible. So it can expand. It's like hydrogen. It's like those octaves before hydrogen. So the atmosphere, the iron isn't able to release any oxygen and the oxides. But when you get to 67 million miles away from the Sun, the pressure is a little less, but it's still so much higher than the pressure on Earth.
This is comparable to being deep inside the Earth where the pressure is immense. Venus, which has thick clouds filled with sulfur and ammonia, will eventually move into a position where conditions might become more Earth-like. In the future, as Earth moves to where Mars is now, Venus will take Earth's current position, possibly in 5 or 6 trillion years. When this happens, life, including humanoids, might develop on Venus, similar to how it developed on Earth.
That asteroid belt that we have right now between Mars and Jupiter, that used to be a planet. And I believe that they had humanoids that developed on there.
This concept is tied to the periodic table because the table represents not just the elements but also the periodic nature of these changes. Elements transform based on changes in motion and pressure conditions. What we call different elements are essentially the same substances behaving differently under varied conditions. For example, if you move your hand in different ways, it might look different each time, but it's still the same hand. Similarly, elements appear different due to changes in their environmental conditions, but they are fundamentally the same substance. As you saw at the beginning of the video, something strange happened when they tried to play a very important video in which Terrence demonstrates how planets can be created. Terrence and his team used a simulator from Princeton to conduct the experiment. In this experiment, they arranged shapes called linchpins, where 6 pentagons meet in a specific order. Let's watch the video. Pay close attention, please.
Before we watch it, let me explain something. If you were to picture the waves at the ocean, you know, the darker the waves, the deeper the water, you can't see a distinguishing fact between them until they crash into each other. That splatter, that little foam that comes out, it lasts for a couple seconds, and then it settles back on there, and it's just the balance between this force and this force. That's the physical universe. Those few seconds that it takes that matter, that more dense water, and the foam to recoalesce and get balanced again with the surrounding environment. That's the entire time that our universe, or all these universes, have worked together.
Okay, so this toroid is just there for a geometrical reference. It just is not actually doing anything. It just kind of symbolically represents a magnetic field. Now on the right-hand side of the model here, I have two groups of vortexes, which are just like tornadoes, spinning tornadoes that are pointing towards the center. As I highlight this object here, you'll see it, that yellow line, right? So there's a bunch of those in there. There's actually 16 of them, and I'll highlight them all. There. I'll render that just so you can kind of see a little bit better. So they're all pointed towards the center, but they're arranged in what we call the linchpin configuration. I'm going to pretend like you never heard of that before. So there's one on the top, and then three in groups of three around that are spaced at 120 degrees apart, and the tilt of these ones on the bottom here is 109.5 degrees in relationship to the top ones that are creating this flat space on the top and the bottom. And they're spaced at 120 degrees radially. And then inside the model is three groups of particle systems with known masses up to 1,000 pounds, from 2.2 pounds to 1,000 pounds. And there's no gravity whatsoever in this model. There's no center attractor. So it's just vortexes and two magnetic fields, a north and a south polarity, and one harmonic resonance, which is emanating a vibration in the field in this region here where these vortexes are pointed. So it kind of just oscillates to give it a little bit of randomness in motion so that the particles will kind of interact and bounce around like smoke or water, waves and water. And then when I hit play, it does it all by itself using physics simulations. So there's no animations at all in this model. And when I play it, this is what pops out.
Wow.
And then when I look down at the top, it makes the actual hexagon that NASA has observed on the top of Saturn.
Without gravity.
Without any gravity. And you'll see that you get a surface of the sphere on the inside with the heavier particles. So the colors...
Are you basically saying, is this saying that you guys can recreate planets?
Yes, this is a particle simulation of the physics involved in making up the planet Saturn.
Terrence Howard is explaining that by changing certain angles in their calculations, they were able to recreate the exact form of Saturn, including its rings, without relying on gravity, dark matter, or dark energy. This was achieved by adjusting the angles at which linchpins, configured with opposing vortices, interact. These adjustments change the motion and pressure conditions, affecting how elements form or crystallize. He ties this idea back to the periodic table, suggesting that with the correct angles of incidence, we can now manipulate materials at a fundamental level. This allows for the creation of new materials like transparent aluminium by controlling the space between elements like carbon, nitrogen, and boron, and working with elements like titanium, vanadium, and chromium. Howard criticizes the traditional Cartesian and Euclidean models, which use straight lines and 90-degree angles, as inadequate. He suggests that nature operates with more complex, curved interactions similar to how bubbles meet and form shapes. This idea is illustrated by dropping a pebble into water, where the waves expand in spheres and interact, creating geometric patterns when they meet. He argues that the universe must be finite because the waves that create shapes would only return if they bounced off an edge. This concept challenges the idea of an infinite universe. Howard believes his method of calculating rotating angles and pressures can predict the arrangement of stars in the Milky Way better than current models used by NASA without relying on dark matter or dark energy. Howard then critiques the theoretical nature of dark matter and dark energy, pointing out that they have never been observed directly. He references the Michelson-Morley experiment from 1887, which tried to detect the ether, a supposed medium through which light travels, but found no effect, leading scientists to assume ether didn't exist. This assumption led to the development of particle physics and Einstein's theory of relativity, which dismissed the ether. Howard mentions that earlier physicists like Lorentz and Maxwell still considered the ether in their theories, but were limited by Newtonian laws. The shift away from considering the ether led to the theoretical focus of modern particle physics, which Howard believes has led science down an incorrect path for the past century. Terrence Howard explains his theory of planetary formation by comparing it to biological processes. Just as living organisms discharge waste, he suggests that stars, like our sun, eject matter, which eventually forms planets. He uses Jupiter as an example. The Great Red Spot on Jupiter, a massive storm, is seen as an area where the planet is discharging matter. Over the course of 1 to 2 billion years, this matter could become a moon. This discharge happens at the planet's equator, similar to how living organisms discharge waste at their midpoint. This ejected matter then orbits and is gradually pushed further out by forces such as solar wind. Howard likens this to coronal mass ejections, CMEs, from the sun, where the sun ejects plasma into space. Over time, this ejected matter gains distance from the sun and can start forming new celestial bodies. For instance, Mercury, being close to the sun, represents an early stage in this process. As time progresses, more planets are formed and pushed outward, creating a dynamic and slowly expanding solar system. This process occurs so slowly that it appears static to us, similar to how plants appear stationary even though they're constantly growing and moving. Using time-lapse photography, we can see plants moving and interacting, but this movement happens at a pace that our brains typically cannot perceive. Howard suggests that planetary formation happens on a similar time scale that our minds struggle to comprehend. In this view, the sun is continuously creating new planets, but it happens over such long periods that it seems static from our perspective. This means that while we observe the solar system as stable, it is actually in a constant state of slow evolution.
Gravity is supposed to be the greater the mass is the greater the attractor. You take a balloon, you rub it on your leg, you put it over the ground. Watch the dust particles jump off the ground, off this big mass called the Earth, and jump onto that balloon. Because why? Electricity is 137 times stronger than the pull of gravity or the effects of the so-called gravity. It's the electric force that's the attractive force. It's the electric force that tightens everything together.
The electric force is the attractive force that pulls things together, acting like a masculine force. On the other hand, the radiative force, or magnetic field, pushes things outward, causing expansion. These forces work together in a cycle of contraction and expansion. When these forces meet at specific angles, like the Birkeland currents, which are plasma currents in space, they can convert magnetic energy back into electricity. This process of contraction and expansion continues, contributing to the formation and sustenance of life and matter. Howard suggests that planets are not just lifeless objects, but are alive and dynamic, created and maintained by these forces. Howard criticizes the concept of gravity, suggesting that what we perceive as gravity is actually the effect of the electric field created by the Earth's spin. When a Saturn V rocket escapes Earth's atmosphere, it is fighting against this centripetal inward spin and the associated electric field, not gravity as traditionally understood. Gravity, in Howard's view, is the effect of the electric field, which is balanced by the radiative magnetic field. The more mass an object has, the greater its electric potential, meaning the electric field becomes stronger, pulling things together more tightly. Howard describes two fundamental directions in the universe: spinning to the right, northeastern direction, which he associates with electric forces; spinning to the left, southwestern direction, associated with magnetic forces and expansion. When elements are close together, the electric force can act without interference from the magnetic field, allowing allowing things to remain tightly bound. If they move apart, the magnetic field causes them to expand and separate.
If you're right, so many people are wrong.
Everyone's wrong. Oh, well, the universe backs me up. And I have the proof of it. You have all these physicists that's saying something different, but none of them have 97 patents. None of them have introduced a new form of flight with unlimited mid-air bonding. None of them have discovered 4 supersymmetrical systems. There's no government on this planet that has the technology that I have or can outdo what I have, because you can't outdo the fractal.
Terrence Howard is explaining that the way we currently do math and understand the universe is limited because it's based on 2-dimensional thinking. He believes the universe actually operates in 3 dimensions, or volumetrically. Instead of just moving in straight lines or flat planes, everything in the universe moves and interacts in all directions. In practical terms, think about a computer chip. Traditional designs make electricity move in straight lines and 90-degree angles. This causes a lot of friction and heat because the electricity has to constantly stop and change direction. Howard suggests that if we design these chips to follow natural curved paths like spirals or spheres, the electricity would flow more smoothly, without generating as much heat or losing energy. This idea is based on how he believes the universe naturally operates. He criticizes traditional math and physics for not considering the constant motion and interaction of everything in the universe. Instead of reducing complex actions to simple, straight-line equations, we should look at the bigger picture and consider all the forces at play. Howard also points out that what we perceive as straight lines aren't truly straight. Even at the microscopic level, everything is made up of tiny curves. He believes that to really understand the universe, we need to think in terms of 3 dimensions and include our perspective as a 4th dimension. This approach, he suggests, can lead to more accurate and efficient technologies and a better understanding of how the universe works. Our perception of straight lines and squares is an illusion. For example, when we look at something straight on, we might see a square, but if we change our perspective and look at it from the side, we realize it's not actually straight. Our senses deceive us into thinking straight lines exist, but in reality, everything moves in curves. He uses the example of homes to illustrate this point. Modern homes are built with straight lines and flat surfaces. However, in hurricane and tornado-prone areas, these homes are easily destroyed. Howard suggests that if we build homes following the natural curves found in nature, like the shape of a mushroom, they would be more resilient. The curved design would allow wind to flow over the structure, reducing damage from extreme weather. Similarly, airplanes are not designed as simple straight boxes. They're aerodynamic, with curved surfaces to allow for smoother, more efficient movement through the air. By moving away from straight-line designs, engineers have created more effective and resilient structures. Howard's main point is that by understanding and mimicking the natural curves and motions of the universe, we can create more durable and efficient designs. Straight lines and flat surfaces are not natural, and by continuing to use them, we're making things more difficult for ourselves. Instead, we should embrace the natural curves and motions that exist all around us.
You're able to produce your own energy. You're able to sustain and coexist with our environment. You're able to, like I said, become a level 1 civilization and utilize all of the resources of the earth and benefit the earth and the creatures of the earth at the same time.
They deliberately did this to hide from the profane people the powers that are in the inner consciousness, because they didn't want literal people getting a hold of these mysteries and using them for their own good. I mean, do you want to spend your life going and listening to preachers? Do you want to spend your life reading the Bible, half of which you can't relate to anyhow, 3/4 of which you can't relate to? Or do you want to now spend your life being a participant in God's universe and touching Him within you? That's the difference. The book of Revelation is about your body. The 2 witnesses that are spoken of in the book of Revelation are the pineal gland in your brain and the pituitary gland, the master gland in your brain. Did you know that? And that all of the fighting that goes on and all of the different nations and the rivers and the seas all deal with the endocrine system of your body and that which is the upheaval in your body. And God, through revelation in the hidden mysteries of the East, is giving you directions on how you can put all of this together and how you can get your body and your mind in harmony. The Bible was not written by people from Pittsburgh. The Bible was written by the ancient Eastern people, and they knew numerology. They dwelled in the numbers of the zodiac. They dwelled in all various numbers that had meanings. Let me give you a quick rundown so you get an idea what I'm talking about. Hidden meanings. The number 1 means God, the Logos. The number 2 means body and soul, you and God. The number 3 means new life, resurrection, a new beginning. Jesus was in the tomb 3 days. Jonah was in the whale 3 days. The number 4 means your fourfold nature: physical, spiritual, intellectual, emotional. Okay? The number 5 means mediation. It also means sacrifice. I'm going to show you that a little later. The number 6 means doctrines, laws, religion. Number 7 means divine intervention. Joshua walked around Jericho how many times? 7. And the walls came tumbling down. 7 means divine intervention. There are 7 nerve centers, there are 7 chakras that rise from the base of the spine to the top, which are the 7 levels which a person walks in order to find that which is the pineal or enlightenment. It's all part of the Bible. It's all part of the ancient wisdom which is covered up in numbers. Number 8 means rupture, separation. Number 9 means the human consciousness. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Number 10 means completion. And the number of perfection in Hebrew is 12, which corresponds to the most ancient zodiac. Let's take a look at the number 9. The numerical value to the word Adam in Hebrew in the ancient scriptures is 9. Everything had a numerical value, and that's why there is such mystery in the ancient scriptures, because they used numbers to deceive people who tried to think intellectually. The number 9 means Adam. Adam means earth. The earth means your flesh, your mind, your emotions, the ego, the macho, the I will do what I think, and all this kind of business, okay? So when you use that number 9, it starts to reveal a lot of things to you. If you look in the Bible, you'll see many references to 3.5 or 42 months, 3.5 years, 42 months. That all comes out to 9. Let me show you how. You'll see it as 42 months. You'll see it as 3.5 years. You'll see it as 1,260 days, because 3.5 years is 6 months. Okay, is 3 years and 6 months. That's 42 months. You take 42 times 30, you get 1,260. Okay, now when you add 1, 2, and 6, you get 9. That's the number of human consciousness. That's the Bible's way of hiding from the literal and the intellectual, spiritual, significant, deep mysteries that come out of the times of Egypt and Chaldea. They deliberately did this to hide from the profane people the powers that are in the inner consciousness, because they didn't want literal people getting a hold of these mysteries and using them for their own good or to raise money the way these evangelists and TV people do. Okay, this isn't for that. This should not cost you a dime. I'll give you a symbol. Tithing. How much money are these people made taking 10% out of your pocket? Tithing has nothing whatsoever to do with money. It's symbolic. It's a hidden myth. And what it means is you have 10% of you that is the carnal mind. 10% of you is the left side, it is the negative side, it is the carnal mind. 90% of you is the right hemisphere, which is dormant. God is saying to you, give me that 10%. Give me your ego. Give me your flesh. Give me your will. Through meditation, shut off the thoughts of the mind. You shut off the 10%, which is you. You turn on the right hemisphere, which is the 90%, which is him. You have tithe. Now, let's look at the number 9. Like I said, we were going to look at the number 9. 3.5 months, 3.5 years, 42 months, they all equate to 1,260 days. If you look through the book of Revelation, you'll see all kinds of references to 3.5, 42, 1,260. They all add up to 9. So now when you have that key, that the number 9 means human consciousness, you can solve some riddles. You can solve the identity of the beast. Who is the beast? 666. Okay? Who is 666? This is the way you have to do it if you understand Eastern mysticism that wrote that. You take 6 plus 6 equals 12 plus 6 equals 18. Now you have 1, 8, 1 plus 8 equals 9. The identity of the beast is you and me, our lower carnal mind. It's the beast that rapes. It's the beast that makes wars. All of these horrible things that you read about every day in your newspaper and see every day on your television. And we can look at the beast by going into our bathroom, turning on the light, and there's a picture of the beast right over your sink. It is your lower mind. It is that part of you that threatens you, that part of you that convinces you you're not going to make it past tomorrow, that part of you that says, well, everything's okay now, but what are you going to do if, and what are you going to say when you meet so-and-so next week, and all of this stuff that keeps you rattling and shaking and all of those things within you going nuts. That's the beast. That's hell. What about those who are saved? What about those who are going to heaven? In Revelation 14, it says 144,000. That means an endless number of saved. But look at the number, 144. 1 plus 4 equals 5 plus 4 equals what? 9. 9 means consciousness. The beast is the lower consciousness. Those who are saved are the higher consciousness, the upper room, the mountain experience, meditation. When you lift yourself up above, you come into being that 144 or consciousness in the higher realm. So 9 then means consciousness, and it shows either on the lower level, which is the devil or hell of the carnal mind, on the higher level, which is the divine mind. There's an interesting way you can see how the Bible specifically shoves this in, so you know it's a tip-off from the ancient people that this is talking about consciousness. Jesus says to the fellows in the boat, look, if you want to catch fish, cast your net over to the right side of the boat, okay? What Jesus is talking about is not fish. Fish means wisdom. He's not talking about the right side of the boat. He's talking about directing your energy to the right hemisphere of the mind. You do that by turning off the left side in meditation. Now, how do we know? Now that we know that the number 9 means consciousness, how do we know that Jesus is talking about consciousness and not fish? You'll see there in that scripture, when Jesus says, cast your net to the right side, you'll see how many fish they caught. They caught 153 fish. Okay? 1 plus 5 plus 3 equals 9. 9 means consciousness. Therefore, Jesus is definitely saying, if you want to be filled with God's wisdom, if you want to be filled with God's understanding, if you want to be filled with God's knowledge of this universe and your place in it, then direct your energies to the right hemisphere. And Jesus told you how to do that by taking no thought. You must meditate. You must allow your eye to be single. You focus that energy right between your eyes and your forehead, and you focus energy there, and you bring yourself above all of those thoughts which are trying to destroy you. You bring yourself up into the bliss of the heaven which is within you, and then you fill with wisdom, you fill with understanding, and you start to activate the right hemisphere of your brain which has been dormant all of your life. Look, you see the same thing in the sky. You see the same thing in nature. The sun right now, as we're sitting talking, the sun in the northern hemisphere is sitting at the right hand. It is sitting in the eastern sky. And what happens when it sits in the eastern, or it sits in the right hand? It brings to life all that was dormant during the winter. It's symbolic too. Paul says the unseen things of God should be made manifest by the things that you can see. In other words, when the sun in the heavens sits at the right hand of power in the eastern sky in the northern hemisphere, summer comes. Everything which was dormant during the winter is gone. Now there are flowers, now there is color, now there is new life. This is what it means. When the Son of Man, the desires of the flesh, the solar plexus is raised to the pineal, the light is at its highest, the power sits at the right hemisphere of the brain, okay? And that then brings to life all that has been dormant in your life during the winter of your soul. Doesn't it make sense? This is what it's about. This is what the hidden meanings of the Bible are about. Everything that is out is in. It is all within you and at your hands to activate it and call it into active participation in your life. Now, and it's never too late. If you're 8 or if you're 98, it doesn't make any difference, because once you raise your consciousness above the thoughts of the mind, there is no age. Lucifer was never a person, was never intended to be a person, was never anybody by the name Lucifer. Lucifer means bright star. Okay? And the reason the name is given Lucifer, the star, and the reason the star, because it has 5 points. Sight, taste, touch, smell, hearing. Bright star. That means when your senses, your ego, are under control of the higher realm of God, then Lucifer. That means everything is under God's control. Fine. But when that star falls, remember Jesus said, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning, the falling star. That means the 5 senses are now under the control of the ego. Sight, taste, touch, smell, and hearing are under your control. And then we got the problems with sex, we got the problems with drugs, we got the problems with booze, we got the problems with our mouth, we got the problems with gossip, we got the problems with the things we see, we got all the problems with the things that we do. We are now in hell. Satan has arrived. That's what it means. Now, once this star fell, and once the five senses come under the control of the ego, okay, and this is what it means, how then are the five senses returned back up into the higher realm? There must be the sacrifice of the five senses. You've got to give the five senses up. You do that by taking no thought. But let me show you how the Bible describes it. Jesus comes along, and what happens? He takes the five wounds, doesn't he? His hands, 2, his feet, 2, and his side, bang, 5 wounds. And as soon as he takes that 5th wound, he becomes the Christ. He then ascends spiritually, and the five senses are returned to God. They fell with Lucifer to Satan. They return to the higher place with God. When the flesh is sacrificed, then the Christ consciousness ascends. That's exactly what the mission is for you. You see, all of this happened where? It happened in Golgotha. Golgotha means skull, which means it's consciousness. People say, oh, he doesn't believe it really happened. It doesn't make any difference. The point is, does it happen now? Does it happen for you? How can you make this? I mean, do you want to spend your life going listening to preachers? Do you want to spend your life reading the Bible, half of which you can't relate to anyhow, 3/4 of which you can't relate to? Or do you want to now spend your life being a participant in God's universe and touching him within you? That's the difference. If so, then the 5 wounds must be taken spiritually as Christ, rising with him into the higher consciousness above human thought, in the skull, Golgotha. Okay, let me show you how the 5 wounds are acted out in your body. It happens to everybody. The whole message is the changing of the five senses of the ego into one, into a oneness with God, right? Well, let me show you how this happens. When you're born, and you can ask any good chiropractor this, when you're born, you have 33 vertebrae. But between the age of 1 and 6, there are 5 vertebrae at the base of your spine area, which fuse into one, and they become the foundation on which you stand. It happens. It happened to you. A miraculous thing happened, or not miraculous, that's a bad word, a natural thing happened to also show you, just as the sun in the sky does, what happens with Lucifer, what happens with Jesus, what happens with the 5 changing into one. Between the age of 1 and 6, the 5 bottom vertebrae in your spine fuse together and become one. The 5 changes into one, and that becomes the foundation upon which you stand. And do you know what they call that place in your spine? The sacrum. You know what it means? It means the sacred place, the holy place. And the reason they call it the sacred place or the holy place is because the 5 has come into being one. And that becomes your foundation. That becomes the entire foundation of Scripture. That becomes the foundation of the fall of man when the 5 are taken over by the ego, becomes the foundation of the resurrection of man when the 5 are given back through meditation and you rise up into Christ consciousness. That's what it's about. That's what happens. That's what the whole Bible is about.
The real God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is often misunderstood. Those who cherish this God have manipulated the actual reality of the texts. He appears most frequently, the Bible. And yes, I said he, because God is described vividly as being a masculine warrior, just like the rest of the known ancient Near Eastern gods. We will unravel the mystery of who the real God of the Bible is by showing you exactly what he looked like. Notice I'm using looked like in the past tense. This is because the ongoing interpretations of the texts describing this God have buried his physical existence in a black hole of philosophy. They have buried God into a metaphysical grave by ignoring the obvious texts which describe him. I want to be upfront and say this documentary is inspired by Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou's absolute goldmine book, God and Anatomy. This book is one of the greatest reads I have ever come across pertaining to bringing God back to life in his original setting, the ancient Near East. For those who don't know, Francesca Stavrakopoulou is a British biblical scholar and broadcaster. She's currently professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient religion at the University of Exeter. Her frustration with people completely ignoring these ancient texts for their theological limitations is also my frustration. I want to know the truth, meaning what does the evidence actually say? Can we come to actually see the God of the Bible for what he would have looked like if we situate him in his historical cultural context? I share the desire to see this God I once devoted my everything to in his actual context. For most of my early life, I believed in the supernatural, where God resides, and that this God was actively controlling this world and its fate. The closest I would come to seeing God was in my imagination, mind, or dreams. I would often equate this God with Jesus and could put a face to God through the New Testament image of Christ. As I started studying the Bible without my theological baggage, I discovered a whole new amazing world around the Bible. Here's an analogy. Imagine being at a David Blaine magic show with thousands in attendance. A person wearing a hoodie in the back corner away from the rest of the crowd whispers, "Hey you, would you like to know exactly how he does his tricks?" Imagine I respond, "What do you mean by trick? David has actual powers. He actually has the ability to do the things we are witnessing." This person insists that David is performing an illusion, doesn't actually have powers. They say, "I can show you how man-made this whole show really is if you're interested." My response is a bit bewildered because I believed that David had the actual powers to perform real magic. I answer, sure, I'm interested in seeing how he does it. In my mind, I'm extremely skeptical that this is just an illusion, and I'm also really afraid of my deepest convictions of the magical world being just an illusion shattered. Part of me wants to really know, and the other part is just afraid. I follow him behind the curtain, and he shows me the wizard with its excellent ability to create an illusion which gives a mass placebo to the auditorium. I now know it's a trick. But does that take away my excitement? Does this ruin the fun? For me, it made me ask this person, "Show me more." My desire to understand at a far, far deeper level has been unlocked. From this point onward, I hang out in the David Blaine shows with my dark hoodie, whispering to the crowd, "Do you really want to know how he does it?" Understanding the Bible, which also entails the God central to it, is a bit like this magic show. Francesca Stavrakopoulou gets it. She sees behind the curtain of theological trickery and shows you God as he really is, or really was. She describes how as an undergraduate in college, she found the feminist scholars took aim at the maleness of God in scripture and how they would just remove God's body from the equation to solve these gender issues. She recounts her engaging in a Q&A with a Christian professor who insisted on the corporeal context of God's body to be metaphorical or poetic. She soberly expresses herself.
Everyone else in the room seemed remarkably content with this approach to the God of the Bible, but I found it deeply frustrating. Why should I look past the clear image of God as a gigantic man with a heavy tread, weapons in his hands, and breath as hot as sulfur? A God who took on a monstrous sea dragon in a physical fight and won. A God who walked about in his heavenly garden and in the cemeteries of his people. A God who stripped a woman naked and offered her up to be gang mutilated. A God who sat on a throne in a temple, enjoying the aroma of scorched animal fat as he waited for his dinner. A God who not only had children, but who willingly and willfully offered up his beloved son to be killed as a sacrifice. How could I not be distracted? Here was a deity just like those I'd visited in museums as a child. A God of ancient myths, fantastic stories and long-lost rituals. A God from the distant past, from a society utterly unlike our own. Those were the terms on which I wanted to encounter him, not as a distant and abstract being, but as the product of a particular culture, at a particular time, made in the image of the people who lived then. A God shaped by their own physical circumstances, their own view of the world, and their own imaginations.
The God which is expressed in her book, God and Anatomy, and of course this documentary,
Is the deity, as his ancient worshippers saw him, a supersized, muscle-bound, good-looking god with superhuman powers, earthly passions, and a penchant for the fantastic and the monstrous?
Following Dr. Stavrakopoulou's book, I will highlight the strong takeaways from her work in this documentary. However, you must understand that her book is so unbelievably fantastic. You would be committing an unforgivable sin not purchasing a copy. It goes into several sources we won't be able to cover in this video. I will also follow her chapter titles for each section as she performs an examination of God's body and will attempt to follow along with the flow of her book. She doesn't shy away from looking at every part of this male deity, shocking to most. She even reveals God's family jewels, which played a significant part in producing godly offspring. Doesn't this imply God might have a wife or a partner? Maybe she will watch this and appreciate MythVision's dedication to stay true to her research and to credit her for her brilliant masterpiece. Thank you, Francesca. Here's to you, my friend. Dissecting the Divine. Spanning back in time, even before written history, humans have made gods into their own images. We all know the famous biblical cliche, we are all made in the image of God. However, experts in the study of mind and cultures have known for a long time the way people think and the biases they have play a big role in how they imagine and create the idea of gods or a higher power in their societies. More than 2,500 years ago, during the late 500s or 400s BCE, a Greek thinker and explorer named Xenophanes of Colophon already figured this out.
If cattle and horses or lions had hands or were able to draw with their hands and do the works that men can do, horses would draw the forms of the gods like horses and cattle like cattle, and they would make their bodies such as they each had themselves.
Xenophanes saw the problem that each culture had a god in their own image. He saw that these gods from all over acted very much like humans, which he saw as an issue for the divine. Looking at how Homer and Hesiod paint the gods as having committed acts unbefitting for the gods by stealing, committing adultery, and tricking each other. His philosophy led him to denounce gods being human-like by their actions, thoughts, or nature. He was also one of the earlier Greek poets and philosophers who can be credited in nudging things toward monotheism. Later, Greek minds like Plato, 429 to 347 BCE, and Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, and schools of thought carrying this torch, taught that the ultimate power that supports and creates everything in the universe doesn't have a physical form. It's an invisible, unseen force or mind that's completely different from the world we can touch and see. Most common folk still held the idea of the gods having bodies like us. These philosophical ideas would eventually have Jewish and Christian thinkers separate their idea of God from the material world, with God dwelling in the spiritual, heavenly realm, completely divorced from the earthly, human one. Thanks to Plato's influence for influencing Western constructions of God, these philosophical notions are not actually compatible with the Bible. God is clearly expressed in anthropomorphic terms, which simply means God has attributes or qualities very human-like, because this is exactly how these ancient authors understood their God.
Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground."
Have you ever noticed the plural description of God creating man and woman? This is clearly the divine entourage, with God who participate in creating mankind. But most don't pay attention to the description of making man in God's image. At least most theologically minded believers. That is because man was made to look like the gods. Yes, that's right. According to Genesis, Adam and Eve were made to look just like God, visually, which made humans superior to all other creatures. You might be shocked or skeptical, but a few chapters later, we get a closer description of what is implied by being made in the image of someone.
When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth.
Elsewhere, we see that divine statues are the visual likeness of the gods they represent. Genesis 1 creation was potentially written in the 5th century, drawing on older myths portraying a god named Yahweh who just ruled Jerusalem, but today is seen as the universal God. When this was written, Yahweh was chief deity among many gods similar to the Babylonian Marduk or Zeus from the Greek world. He was still centuries away from being seen as without a body. As Francesca says in the book,
instead, he was just like any other deity in the ancient world. He had a head, hair, and a face, eyes, ears, a nose, and a mouth. He had arms, hands, legs, and feet, and a chest and a back. He was equipped with a heart, a tongue, teeth, and genitals. He was a god who breathed in and out. This was a deity who not only looked like a human, albeit on a far more impressive, glamorous scale, but who very often behaved like a human. He enjoyed evening strolls and hearty meals. He listened to music, wrote books, and made lists. He was a god who not only spoke, but whistled, laughed, shouted, wept, and talked to himself. He was a god who fell in love and into fights, a god who squabbled with his worshippers and grappled with his enemies, a god who made friends, raised children, took wives, and had sex.
She expresses that this isn't something on some old clay tablets of mythologies about gods. This is the clear language of the Bible. This Bible is made of several books with various genres, with the first parts of the Bible being the Hebrew original called Tanakh by Judaism and Old Testament by Christians. The Tanakh was written between the 8th and 2nd centuries BCE in Judah. Judah was the areas we call today Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and western Syria. Judah was conquered by Assyria in the 8th century BCE, again by Babylon in the 6th century BCE, and was part of the Persian Empire in the 5th century BCE. Then they were brought into Alexandria when Alexander the Great brought the empire around 333 BCE. The biblical texts express these changes from political empire to the next, while giving fun stories of very ancient mythical and legendary heroes. It contains oracles claimed to come from various prophets, as well as poetry, ritual songs, prayers, and teachings. Absolutely none of these texts have made it down to us in their original form, with scribes recreating, making additions, revisions, all to reflect the interest of later generations. It's safe to say that the Torah and the remainder of the primary history portray God's special relationship with Israelites. These authors crafted a past for their heritage, giving them a unique identity. Much of the writings that discuss historical events should be taken with a grain of salt. While there is real events described in some of the material, non-biblical material has shown us the Bible's portrayal of past events should not be taken as reliable recorded history. Don't believe me? Well, take the 9th century BCE Northern Kingdom of Israel ruler named Omri. In the biblical texts, he is demoted and insignificant, with only a mention of founding Samaria. A stone monument set up by Mesha, the king of Moab, a place near ancient Israel, celebrates taking back large areas of land from Omri, king of Israel, and his follower, who had ruled over Moab for a long time. Records from Assyria, a powerful empire during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, often refer to the kingdom of Israel as Omri land and its kings as sons of Omri, showing that Omri's influence lasted a long time. However, the writer of the books of Kings in the Bible downplayed or even hid how important Omri was. This is hinted at by a brief mention of the rest of the acts of Omri and the power that he showed. It's obvious the biblical authors had Jerusalem as their central focus, with the only legitimate worship of Yahweh. Problem was, there were several Yahweh temples in town, and these authors portrayed Judah's kings who closed them down as righteous. Archaeology has revealed an 8th century BCE southern Judah Yahweh fortress, another in the 5th century Egyptian island of Elephantine, as well as a 5th to 2nd century BCE Mount Gerizim site. Point being, the worship of Yahweh was not as centralized as these elite authors pinned it to be in the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is so driven by ideology that it is often unreliable, living with the trauma of the Babylonian troubles leading into the Persian Empire, potentially starting the literary works we see today. During the Second Temple period, scribes and priests were successful and reworked old texts, creating new ones through the perception of exile, return, and restoration. Of course, the texts exaggerate that all Judahites experienced restoration, but reality shows only the elites and some of the higher classes had even been deported to Babylonia, and the majority remained there in Judah. Many Judahites migrated to various locations like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant during these heated political times. Eventually, Greece takes over from Persia, where most Jewish peoples read in Aramaic and Greek. This led the reading of their sacred scriptures in these languages. Among them were the Jewish Jesus movement, which took on a life of its own over a few generations, with all their literature, gospels, epistles written in Greek, and their text overshadow the Hebrew scriptures as time goes by. Okay, back to God's body. There isn't a single place anywhere in the Bible denying God's body. In fact, it is only affirmed. Some mortals were lucky enough to see it. After leaving Egypt, a group of Israelite leaders went up to Mount Sinai and saw what they believed were God's feet, and then God himself. Moses was among them, and he's said to have had a regular friendly chat with God, as if talking to a friend. But Moses wasn't the only one who reportedly encountered God in person. In the Bible's Genesis, Abraham walks with God, and Jacob wrestles with him. The prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, in the books named after them, both describe seeing God on his throne, while Amos sees him standing in a temple. In the New Testament, Jesus claims he has seen God and is even described as sitting next to God in heaven. One may point to Adam walking with God in the cool of the day, or Stephen from the book of Acts. Also, John in Revelation on the island of Patmos. During the Second Temple period, circa 515 BCE to 70 CE, when the temple was destroyed, people understood God to hide his body from the world not visible to most humans. Just because a body can't be seen doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The Ten Commandments hint at a suggestion to the idea of making images of God was a normal practice by those worshiping Yahweh.
You shall not make for yourself a carved image, whether in the likeness of what is in the heavens above, or what is on the earth below, or what is in the waters beneath the earth.
The Israelites were no different than their next-door neighbors. People believed that while gods usually stayed hidden in their heavenly homes, they could choose to show themselves on earth as statues and places of worship. These statues weren't just symbols. People believed that statues were the actual God, not just a representation of them. People today think this is stupid. However, that's misrepresenting these ancient minds. They perceived reality not just to the physical, but from natural to supranatural. They saw these realms to be passable in both directions. These gods could technically be in more than one place in their world. Francesca mentions how ancient Mesopotamian ritual experts comment on the gods.
The divine statue was born in heaven and made on earth.
Technically, these gods weren't limited to one location. They could be invisible in the heavens, at the same time showing up as stars, statues in places of worship, figurines at home, or even natural or even invisible forces on earth. But I can hear the apologists say, the ban on images is evidence that God didn't have a body and shouldn't be portrayed in idols, making this God different. You are wrong, my friends. Several cults from Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and the Phoenicians practiced what's called aniconism. Aniconism is when religions or cultures don't create images or figures to represent things from the natural world, the supernatural, or certain beings. You can find this in Buddhism as well as Islam. Shoot, it even shows up in certain places in Hinduism. And while these earlier cults practiced imageless worship, they were understood to have bodies. Prohibiting divine images in the Ten Commandments points towards God's hiddenness of his body, not that he didn't have one. This idea is a step in the direction of the abstract, incorporeal deity of the post-biblical religions of Judaism and Christianity. The Bible describes God as having a human-like form, a personal name, a history, a family, and even a group of heavenly beings that accompany him.